Hello, this is Dr. James Strickler, and this is a course in United States history. This lecture concerns Chapter 23, the Great Depression, in the United States history textbook, American Yawp. The first thing to address in this chapter about the Great Depression is the origins of the Great Depression. And to address that, I first have to explain what the Great Depression is. The Great Depression was a severe economic downturn in the United States, and in fact in the entire world, that took place in the 1930s. It's the worst economic downturn in American history. It was a time in which the United States economy got smaller year after year, and people lost their jobs. People didn't have enough food to eat. There was little hope for many people. And in the midst of that, we had the greatest government intervention into people's lives that had ever taken place to that point in the country's history too. That's what the story of this decade is, of depression and government action to mitigate that depression. So historians oftentimes cite the stock market crash on Black Tuesday in October of 1929 as the beginning of the Great Depression. Now, this isn't the cause of the Great Depression. Sure, it may have been a contributing factor, or it may just be an example of how the Great Depression began to affect things, more a symptom than a cause. However we want to label it, it's the moment that people began to realize that something was wrong. What happened was a few days before, the stock market had started to decline dramatically. And big financial people, such as J.P. Morgan, the famous banker, tried to halt this decline by very publicly going and purchasing stocks on the stock exchange to try to instill confidence in investors. Well, it didn't work. A few days later, the stock market started to crash anyway. What happens is investors buy stocks assuming that they'll go up in value and that they can sell them for more than what they paid for them. But when they start to decline in value instead, investors may panic and just try to sell the stock for whatever they can get for it before all its value is gone. This panic then causes others to panic, and soon the value of everything is crashing. That's what happened on Black Tuesday. People lost entire fortunes. J.D. Rockefeller, the richest man in American history, lost 4/5 of his wealth when the stock market crashed. Now, there weren't a lot of people in the country in general invested in the stock market during this time. So this didn't affect the money of common American citizens. But among the wealthy elite it did. And that could have a chain reaction through the economy too. Once the wealthy don't have money to spend, then they can't hire people from the other classes to do stuff for them and pay them to do it. The reason the stock market crashed was probably because of speculative investments. Money was easy to come by during this time period. Taxes were relatively low on the wealthy. Also, they had easy access to loans that they could get to have more money. They also could get low interest rates on the loans that they got. This made it easy for them to have lots of money. But then what do you do with lots of money if you have it? You try to make more money from it by investing in something. And one way to do that is through speculative investments. This is where you don't buy something because it actually has value in and of itself, or at least not as much value as what you're paying for it. You buy it simply because you believe that somebody will want to pay more for it later. This inflates the value of it, and then somebody else comes along and says, wow, people are buying that because they think it's going to go up, I'll buy some too, and it causes it to go up more. This then creates bubbles that eventually pop. And this is what happened with the stock market. A bunch of speculative investment then led to panic when prices started falling, and the stock market crashed as a result. Now, as I said, the stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It may have been a contributing factor, but there were many others. One of the other factors was market saturation. In a previous chapter, I talked about how people who are selling products to the mass public had to learn new ways to sell these things. It's because by this time in American history, most Americans had their basic needs met. They had enough food to eat, they had clothes to wear, they had shelter over their head. So if you're going to continue to just sell stuff to them, you had to sell them stuff that they didn't really need. And manufacturers figured out ways to do that. Sell them cars to make it more convenient to get to work than walking or riding a horse. Sell them radios so they can listen to programs for entertainment, etc. But even as you convince them to buy these more things, the things that they were being convinced to buy were generally what we call durable goods. What we mean by that is they last for years. So once you buy a radio for your living room, it's not going to break the next week and you have to buy another radio. Instead, you're done buying radios for years to come. You buy a car, you're done buying cars for years to come. This presents a problem for the people that manufacture these things. Once they've sold enough that everybody who wants one has one, who do they sell to then? That's called market saturation. And that was happening throughout the production world in the time where the Great Depression gets started. Suddenly demand is falling because people already have all the durable goods they need. As demand falls, then they no longer have to employ people to make this stuff. Now those people don't have jobs to buy other things. And this sends a ripple effect through the economy, causing not just the business that has a saturated market, but all businesses to do less business. Another cause of the Great Depression, which is often cited by economists as perhaps the most important cause, was the SmooHawley Tariff. The SmooHawley Tariff was a law that was put in place to tax goods coming into the United States. The logic behind this was, if manufacturers in the United States were having trouble selling stuff, maybe a way to help people want to buy more of the things being manufactured in the United States was to make the competition for those items from foreign products too expensive. So let's just take cars, for example. If we want people to buy American cars, then we put a tax on cars coming in from Germany. This makes the German cars too expensive for Americans to buy. They then buy the American cars instead. That was the theory behind it. But what happened with the SmooHawley Tariff was it actually caused other countries around the world to pass retaliatory tariffs, where they would not allow American goods into their countries without paying a tax, which made it too expensive for people in those foreign countries to buy American goods. In a short time, the amount of products that the United States manufacturers were shipping to other countries around the world fell by over 70%. Well, now that manufacturers aren't selling as much to other countries, they don't need as many employees. They lay off those employees. Now those employees don't have jobs. They can't go buy things, which then causes the manufacturers of those other things to not sell as much, which means they lay off workers too. This caused a negative ripple effect through the economy also. A final thing that probably contributed to the coming of the Great Depression was the tightening of credit. Now, what this refers to is the fact that people had gotten in the habit during the 1920s of buying major purchases by taking out loans. In other words, buying them on credit. Well, in a society where people are buying things on credit, one of the things that can cause the economy to contract, get smaller, which is what a recession or a depression really is that you start limiting the amount of credit that people can use. They don't buy as many things, which means the factories don't need to make as many things, which means they don't need as many employees hired, etc., as we've already talked about. Well, the reason credit was tightened at this time when it seemed like it was a bad idea, that it would just cause the economy to get worse, was because the politicians in charge of this made a mistake. They noticed what had happened when the stock market had crashed because of speculation. And they recognized that the speculation had taken place because people had too much extra money laying around. So they decided to tighten up the credit. Now this is done through the Federal Reserve. That's what's pictured here. The Federal Reserve controls the money supply. They have several different mechanisms that they can do this to either encourage or discourage banks from giving people loans. Well, when they discourage banks from giving people loans, as they did in this case, then that tightens the credit market. The reason they did this was because, as I said, they saw that the stock market crash was caused by investors having too much money and speculatively inflating the stock market. To prevent that from happening again, they decided to limit how much money was out there. The problem is that the issue they were trying to fix had already happened. The speculation had already taken place. The collapse of the stock market had already taken place. This was not a time that they needed to tighten up the money, which would then cause there to be less things bought and sold elsewhere in the economy. But they made the mistake of trying to fix a problem that was already past fixing, and it made things worse. As a result of these many factors combining to cause the economy to contract, people became concerned about their own personal money. Maybe they got laid off from a job, and so they went to their bank to take out their savings to live upon. Well, once you get a bunch of people all coming to a bank at the same time, the bank can run out of money. How can the bank run out of money? Well, when you deposit your money with a bank, they don't just put it in a vault and leave it there waiting for you. They loan it out to other people. Now, they have certain patterns that they recognize of people coming in to get their money. They know about how much they have to have on hand in a given day to satisfy whatever needs they may have of people coming in and asking for their deposits back. So, as long as they don't loan out too much money, they have enough left over to meet the needs of who is expected to come in on any given day. But this presents a problem when way too many people come in. As they might do as the economy begins to contract, they begin to panic about needing their money. So they then go to the bank and ask for their money, and the bank has to tell them, well, we ran out of money today, we don't have enough. They tell all their friends and neighbors, and then their friends and neighbors say, oh my gosh, my bank might run out too, and they go to run to take money out of their bank. Pretty soon all the banks are running out of money. And this causes the banks to fail, to collapse, to go out of business. Then the people who ran to get their money end up getting no money because the bank is out of business. Their money is lost. Well, during this time period of the Great Depression kicking off, there were about 2,000 banks around the United States in 1932 that ran out of money. You combine all these things together. You have manufacturing declining, people losing their jobs, the banks running out of money, and you have a formula where suddenly many people are destitute, in need. And the way that this ends up being solved is the government steps in to help them. That's what the story of the Great Depression is really about, and how it continues to affect American life today. Next, we want to talk about politics during the Great Depression. How when it got started out, the President of the United States had to try to deal with it, and how that led us to having a new President of the United States. In 1928, a man named Herbert Hoover was elected president as a Republican over the Democrat Al Smith. Herbert Hoover winning the election had an effect on how the United States would respond to the beginnings of the Great Depression, starting with the stock market crash in 1929. The reason for this is because Herbert Hoover brought his own life experiences to the presidency. He was an orphan who ended up excelling in everything he did, went on to graduate from Stanford Law School and make millions in the mining industry. He then oversaw the American relief efforts in Europe after World War I. So he was a self-made man. When he looked at other people in the world who are facing problems like he did when he was an orphan, he thought, well, if I can just work hard and overcome those problems, then other people can just work hard and overcome their problems too. So this gave him a certain attitude about how to deal with the problems of the Great Depression. When people were out of work, he generally felt it was their responsibility to go find a job, that kind of thing, rather than necessarily depending on the government to step in to help them. Now, he did make some use of government power, but not nearly as much as other people would want to. When the Depression got started, Herbert Hoover thought the solution was something he called associationalism. What he meant by associationalism was that groups of people, and particularly groups of businesses, should just naturally on their own band together to try to help others through this crisis. Now, he didn't think about this as just plain old charity. He thought about this as a good investment on the part of the business. So we'll take the example in the picture here. You see the sign that says that this building is occupied by Progressive Independent Grocers Association, and it's their welfare relief department. There it says free bread and food, and you've got people crowded outside to get this. So the example here is that you have grocers, people who sell groceries to people, who they realize there's people out of money who can't buy groceries. So they set up a system working together, not just one grocery store, but a whole organization of grocery stores, to give free food to these people. Now, why do that? How is that an investment? Well, if you're the grocers, you see these people as future customers who will remember kindly that you helped them during their time of need and will then bring their business back to you once they are back on their feet economically. Herbert Hoover thought that the Great Depression could be solved by these kind of relationships, that businesses should cooperate together, and of their own free will they should help people in need as an investment in their future income earnings. Now, while some of this took place, there wasn't nearly enough of it. Oftentimes these charitable organizations that were in the process of trying to help people would run out of money, and that soon all the charity that these organizations were trying to give to people wasn't sufficient. But along the way, Herbert Hoover stuck to this belief that the private acts of charitable organizations and of businesses through associationalism could work. Matter of fact, he even set up a presidential organization for unemployment relief. Now, its official title may have just been the Organization for Unemployment Relief, but it was typically called the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief. This allowed the use of the acronym POUR, P-O-U-R, to describe it. You had poor trying to help with the poor. Now, the way they did this was by trying to encourage private businesses to act through associationalism to voluntarily help people out. And there was this belief that if everyone stuck together, if they all saw it through, just as in this ad from the poor organization, if individuals saw it through and other individuals saw it through, then everyone could work together and we could get through the crisis. This was Herbert Hoover's belief. But as the Depression deepened and became worse, he realized that government had to do something. So Herbert Hoover finally, in 1932, supported the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This is a corporation that, rather than stepping in and trying to directly provide aid to people who are suffering through the Depression, instead what it did was it provided loans for businesses. So imagine you have a business running, and you're dependent on people buying your product in order to have money to manufacture additional product, but now people have stopped buying, which means you have no reason to manufacture, which means you have no reason to keep people in their jobs, that then if you lay those people off their jobs, now they don't buy other things, and as I said before, it has a ripple effect through the economy. Well, what if the United States government stepped in and provided you with loans for you to keep your business going? You'd be able to pay your employees, keep them working, you'd be able to buy the raw materials, you'd be able to continue to manufacture. And if everyone did this, then everyone would have jobs and they'd be buying each other's products. So this was designed as a way to stimulate the economy, stimulating it at the supply end, giving loans to the businesses to stay in business. And this is very much the sort of approach that someone like Herbert Hoover might have. He doesn't want to give welfare out to people. He wants them to help themselves, but he's going to provide businesses with the opportunity to stay in business so they can provide jobs for those people. This is a fairly light touch compared to other sorts of government programs that would come along later. While Herbert Hoover was still in office, he faced a crisis concerning something called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans, and in some cases their wives and their children, who marched on Washington, D.C. and encamped there, demanding the payment of Army bonuses that they had been promised as veterans of World War I. Now, this happened because they were desperate. These are people who had lost jobs, who needed to pay for their housing, their food, whatever. And so they took desperate measures, marching to Washington, D.C. to show how important this cause was to them. But the thing that they were demanding was something that they weren't quite entitled to. Yes, when they left the military after the end of World War I, they were promised bonuses from the U.S. Army for having gone to serve. But those bonuses were not due to be paid until 1945. So they were demanding them 13 years early. And this was something that Congress seriously considered doing. But eventually Congress reached the conclusion that this would add too much debt to the national government to do it right now, that they would wait till 1945 to pay the bonuses. At that point, many of the demonstrators in the bonus army decided to just go home and give up. But not all of them went home. Some of them remained encamped through Washington, D.C. They remained agitating for their money. Well, Herbert Hoover decided that there was enough of this, and he sent in General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the bonus army. Douglas MacArthur brought local police with him and U.S. military troops. He rolled through the bonus army encampment with tanks. He shot tear gas in when people wouldn't move. They physically removed the people from the camps and then burnt the camp down. When this was reported in the media, it was seen, though, as a heartless act. These people were desperate. They were Army veterans that had fought for our country. They were out of work. And then they were met with violent removal and the burning of their little tent city that they had created. This was generally viewed as an insensitivity on Hoover's part toward the plight of the needy during the Depression. This is one of the factors that led to him not being returned to office in the next election. Now let's take a moment to talk about what the experience was of the people at the bottom of the economic ladder during the Great Depression. Middle-class people and rich people had a better chance of getting through the Depression without it having a severe impact on their lives. Maybe their house was already paid off. Maybe they could double up with other family members to make ends meet. Maybe they had savings they could take out to try to live upon. They had a better chance of dealing with the problems than people at the bottom of the economic scale who were already living on the edge, who didn't have any resources to turn to once their job was lost. Those people at the bottom of the economic scale, who oftentimes were only fleetingly employed in good times, moving from one job to another, barely having enough to eat and live off of, then found themselves without any jobs during the Great Depression. That meant that they couldn't pay for a place to live, but they had to live somewhere. So this led to the establishment of various shanty towns, as the generic term is, as they would move on to oftentimes unclaimed or public land, and then use whatever resources they could get their hands on, wood, sheet metal, whatever it might be, to build little shacks that they could live in, so that they at least had some place to get out of the weather. Well, these shanty towns, which are a common feature around the world outside big cities, such as places like in Brazil or Africa, these were not considered a normal condition in the United States of America. So many homeless, destitute people suddenly erecting shacks, acres of shacks on public lands or in abandoned lots. This shocked people, and they decided to call these improvised villages Hoovervilles. This shows how they blamed Herbert Hoover, whether rightfully or wrongly, for the difficulties of the Great Depression that fell on these people that had to build these shacks to live in shanty towns. Next topic we want to talk about is migration. Now notice this is migration, not immigration. We're not talking about people coming in from other countries. We're talking about people moving around within the United States of America. One of the biggest things that caused people to move during the Great Depression was the Dust Bowl. When Americans moved onto the Great Plains, what they ended up doing was plowing under the native plants or burning them away so that then they could plant cash crops, like wheat, for example. Now, the wheat that they planted was not designed by nature to stay there and keep the ground cover in place. The roots of the natural plants kept the soil from blowing away. These planted crops did not necessarily do the same. But, at least to begin with, they didn't have to, because the Great Plains for several years received above average rainfall, kept the soils moist, kept them from blowing away. But beginning in 1932 through 1936, the Great Plains experienced a drought, which led to the soil drying up and eventually blowing away because there was nothing left to hold it down. These were the Dust Bowl years. And the giant dust storms that were created across the Great Plains in some cases reached as far away as Washington, D.C. Now, if you were a person living in the Dust Bowl during this time period, where the soil where you grow your food is just blowing away in the wind, you realize you aren't going to make it if you stay there. So people by the thousands or even millions picked up their belongings, what they could carry with them on a car or a wagon, and they headed out looking for better opportunities. The state of Oklahoma experienced a decline in population during this time period of nearly 40%. So people fled the Dust Bowl states looking for better opportunities elsewhere. Many of these people were called Okies. This is a reference to the mass number of them that left Oklahoma. Here we see a picture of a family from Oklahoma making their way to California looking for opportunities. But when you have a bunch of dislocated people, in this case refugees from the Dust Bowl, all flood into a place, the easy jobs for them to find are quickly already occupied by others who got there first. You end up glutting the market for labor. And then these people that may have traveled thousands of miles looking for help are then left with nothing. Two famous artistic things illustrate the struggle of these people during the Great Depression. The photo on the left, taken by a photographer named Dorothea Lange, shows a migrant mother with her children. The look of worry upon her face and seen in the body language of the children is palatable. You can really understand how worried she was. She was traveling, trying to look for a better place to live, trying to find a way to feed her family, and was worried about whether she would ever make it and make a better life for them. Another example is the novel written by the author John Steinbeck called The Grapes of Wrath. It follows one of these Okie families from Oklahoma coming to California looking for a better life. It was turned into a movie the year after it was published. This picture and this book and movie have become lasting images for us of what life was like in the Great Depression, particularly among the migrants who were moving about looking for a better life. But their efforts to move about and look for a better life were not always rewarded. Some states, such as Florida, California, and Colorado, set up border blockades where they would not let destitute Americans from other states come and move where they were. This is simply because they didn't think they had enough jobs for the newcomers. They were already struggling to find their own jobs, and suddenly if a bunch of newcomers came in, then they would find the jobs instead, particularly if they were desperate enough to work for less. So what happened in these states is that in some cases they put up border blockades in Florida, Colorado, California, where they stopped people entering the state and wouldn't let them in unless they already had a job waiting for them. This is a good way to illustrate the battle between those who had lost everything and those who desperately did not want to lose everything. Now, in addition to not wanting their fellow Americans to come into their areas that might be a little bit more prosperous, they also didn't want to compete with foreigners from other countries for the same jobs and food that Americans so desperately need. This led to the deportation of many Mexicans. Small towns might round up all the Mexicans in the town and put them on a bus and ship them over the border to get rid of them. After Herbert Hoover lost the presidency and Franklin Roosevelt came into office, this then gave us the first New Deal. Addressing the issues of the Great Depression was going to be difficult for any politician because the economy was performing worse than it ever had in American history. In 1932, unemployment peaked at 25%. That means 1 out of every 4 men who wanted a job could not find one. And even those who found jobs oftentimes had to settle for less job than what they wanted. This then was the background for the 1932 election. A quarter of the country's out of work. What are you going to do about it? Herbert Hoover had already had his chance as the Republican who was in office, and the country roundly rejected him, deciding to instead side with Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat. They did this switch because while Herbert Hoover had had a chance to deal with the Great Depression, he had not done so adequately in people's minds. Franklin Roosevelt was the fresh start, a bunch of new ideas to get us out of this great economic difficulty. But it wasn't just Franklin Roosevelt that defeated Herbert Hoover. The Democratic Party as a whole defeated the Republican Party as a whole. The Democrats gained a margin of over 100 seats in the House of Representatives, and they also had a landslide in the United States Senate. They took control of both houses of the United States Congress, and they then had control with the presidency of the entire lawmaking process. Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected president in 1932, was a man who kept something important about himself private from the world. He had been paralyzed by contracting polio a few years before he actively entered politics. He was paralyzed from the waist down. What you see here is only one of only two known photos of him actually in a wheelchair. He did not want anyone to see him in a wheelchair. He thought it made him look weak. So he improvised all kinds of ways to avoid being seen in a wheelchair. He might drive up onto a podium in a car to give a speech, claiming he was in such a hurry he didn't have a chance to get out of the car before he had to race to the next town. He might have his aides help him to stand up at the podium before the audience is let in to see him, and then have the audience ushered out before he sits down. The way he was able to stand, and in some cases even appear to walk, was he had a big metal framework that he wore on his lower body, and he could use his control of his upper body to swing his hips. So he'd swing one hip forward and slide his one foot forward, and then swing his other foot forward and slide his other foot forward. This was an elaborate ruse to get people to think that he was healthy when he was not. When he contracted polio, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, helped him through the crisis. She was a great benefit to him. But historians now wonder what the real nature of their relationship was. They were married. They appeared to be affectionate toward each other. They had several children. But at the same time, Franklin Roosevelt had a longtime mistress who would go on trips with him. When he eventually died at a spa in the state of Georgia, it was not his wife Eleanor Roosevelt that was his side, but it was his mistress. We also learned from Eleanor Roosevelt's letters that were preserved and are now available to the public that her secretary was likely her lesbian lover. So, they both had outside relationships, yet they maintained their marriage because they were ambitious people and they realized that sticking together could help them both get to where they wanted to be. Franklin Roosevelt was the governor of New York when he accepted the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1932. He was the first candidate for president of either major political party to offer an acceptance speech at the convention that chose him. In that acceptance speech, he talked about that he pledged to the American people a New Deal, as he put it. Well, that name stuck, and when he got into office, his actions became known as the New Deal. Roosevelt planned what he would do in office with the help of an elite group of intellectuals that he had gathered from the elite universities of the country, places like Columbia and Harvard. These are people that advised him about how to attack the economic situation and try to get the country out of the Great Depression. Collectively, they were known in the media as Roosevelt's Brain Trust, a group of people that, in a sense, he used as a way to control what was being said and done. They were the ones that provided him with the advice that he needed to lay out a series of programs that he thought, as president, would help us get out of the economic slump that was the Great Depression. When he was inaugurated President of the United States in the spring of 1933, after having won the election in 1932, he gave his first inaugural address. The most famous line from it was that he told Americans they have nothing to fear but fear itself. This is a reference back to the problem of panic in economic crises. Panic always makes things worse. Panic is what led to the stock market crashing. Panic might be preventing America from beginning to recover as Roosevelt took office. He wanted people to not panic anymore, not make rash decisions. He wanted them to calm down and work together, kind of like Herbert Hoover did, even though he would provide more government programs to do it. Mostly, he just wanted them to stop worrying. He wanted them to no longer have fear of the future, or they might make their own fearful future come true. Once Roosevelt was in office, he became very active in trying to get a bundle of legislation passed during his first 100 days. A whole bunch of programs that became known as the alphabet soup programs, because each of them was known by a set of initials. He was perhaps the most successful president in history in getting an ambitious agenda through Congress in the first days of his presidency. These programs collectively became known as the New Deal. One of the first things Roosevelt did when he got into office was he declared a national banking holiday. His actions were then confirmed by Congress when they passed the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. They didn't even have a chance to read the text of the act before they voted for it, but they understood the gist of what was going to happen because of what Roosevelt had already done. The idea was to stop a rush on the banks by just shutting them all down. And then in a few days, you'd start sending inspectors around to examine the bank's history, to examine what kind of books they held, whether or not they had enough money on hand to get back into business, whether they could safely guard their customers' deposits. When they found that a bank would be safe, they would then allow it to open up for business again. This was done so that people banking at that bank would feel confident that their money would be safe and they wouldn't make a rush on it. So this procedure was designed to instill confidence in the banks and stop runs on them. To try to give people confidence in the banks and in the general economy, and to try to prevent their panic fears, Roosevelt began in 1933 a series of radio broadcasts that became known as fireside chats. They were called this because of his informal manner during the radio broadcasts, as he just simply tried to encourage people and explain his programs. They became a staple of his presidency and connected him to the people of the country. Many people from that time period remember those broadcasts fondly as an occasion that gave them courage to face the future. The next big piece of legislation that Roosevelt got passed, among many of them, to try to fight the Great Depression, was the Glass-Steagall Banking Act. The most important part about this act was it created federal deposit insurance. This was insurance backed by the United States government that would ensure any depositor in that bank that even if the bank failed, they would get their money paid back by the federal government up to $100,000. This gave people confidence that they could put their money in banks and that it wouldn't disappear. The bank would not fail and leave them with no money. By giving them that confidence, then banks would have money on hand that they could then use potentially to loan to other customers to try to get the economy stimulated. Another one of these many programs passed in the first 100 days of Roosevelt's presidency was the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was an organization set up to hire young men, to take them out in the wilderness, to help them, to have them plant trees, dig roads, fire breaks, things like that, to try to conserve the natural world. It was a way to get these jobless young men out of the cities, out in the countryside doing something productive, and to give them money at a time when money was hard to come by. Another program was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was a program that provided money for states to set up programs to help the unemployed. The example seen in this photo was a camp set up in a state where young women were brought and they were trained in various skills that they could use to potentially get jobs. In this case, these 3 young ladies are learning how to be secretaries. Again, this is an idea where you take federal money and you distribute it out in a way where people do something for it, such as in the previous slide, maybe planting trees, or here learning how to be secretaries. And you hope that in the process you will stimulate economic activity, which will eventually provide people with real jobs. Another of the programs was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration offered a deal to farmers. The deal was, don't plant crops and we'll pay you. Now, why would they want farmers to not plant crops? Well, in a society in a depression where people don't have a lot of money to buy crops, if too many crops are raised, then this drives down the value of them all. There aren't enough people to buy them, the price dwindles. So you should somehow limit the number of crops being raised, so it better fits demand and the prices stay high enough that the people raising them can actually make a living off of planting them and selling them. But the problem is you've got too many farmers for the amount of crops that you need right then. So what to do with the extra farmers? They need to have a living too. So the government offered them money to not raise crops. So this was the deal. Don't plant crops and the government will pay you. That was done under the Agricultural Adjustment Administration. It was designed to both control the amount of agricultural product being raised and the prices that it ended up being sold for. Perhaps the biggest thing created during the initial days of the New Deal was the National Recovery Administration. The National Recovery Administration turned the idea of trust busting on its head. So over the last few decades prior to this in American history, there was a big push to use the powers of government to prevent businesses from monopolizing the market and to address lots of ways that they tried to get around with that, such as collusion of different businesses where they might cooperate together to set the same prices so they aren't really competing with each other. That was a no-no. That was until the Great Depression came along and the National Recovery Administration was created. It actually encouraged collusion among businesses to set prices that could sustain the business and to cooperate with their competitors to make sure that they all set the same price so everybody had to buy at that price and they could all survive. Now, this went against the old attitudes, and frankly, it was a violation of antitrust laws. So what the National Recovery Administration did was it waived those antitrust laws for businesses, but it only did so under certain conditions. The businesses had to agree to take this money that they were making and use it to provide fair living wages for their employees. Had to allow their employees to organize into unions, had to not make them work too many hours, things like that. And if they went along with this plan, where they could collude with other similar businesses to create what they called codes that governed what they would sell their products for, and if they then also held up their end of the bargain by providing a good environment for their employees, they were then allowed to put up in their windows and on their products a label, this NRA member label with a blue eagle on it. The blue eagle became the symbol of businesses that were cooperating with the United States government to try to help people. So this was a valuable thing for them to put up so that customers who wanted to believe that we were all in it together would go shop at Blue Eagle businesses. Now, all these programs that are being created during this time period, Roosevelt's first 100 days, and others that will come as I talk about them in a moment, are of questionable constitutionality. The United States Congress is only supposed to pass laws for which they can point to some specific power in the Constitution that allows them to pass that law. Well, there's nothing in the Constitution about them doing the things in these programs that I've talked about so far and about the ones that I'll talk about in addition. So they're all on shaky constitutional ground. But Roosevelt and the Congress did them anyway because they felt it was an emergency and people needed to be helped in these ways, whether the Constitution really said they could or not. And that's eventually going to come back to potentially haunt the New Deal. The next program I want to talk about is the Civil Works Administration. What the Civil Works Administration did was it hired people to carry out mostly manual labor jobs by the millions during the hard winter of 1933 to 1934. This was a stopgap measure. It was designed to just get people through the hard winter so they had money to buy heating oil and food and things like that for their family. Here you can see a line of men with wheelbarrows moving dirt. This is the kind of thing that was done. They hired people to use shovels and wheelbarrows to move dirt as a way to employ them. Now, this wasn't just pointless. Maybe they were moving the dirt to build a road or a canal or something. But it was something that probably could have been done more efficiently with machines. But instead, you hire a bunch of men with shovels to do it slowly as a way to just give them jobs temporarily. Now, this idea of providing jobs for people found more permanent solutions in things like the Works Progress Administration. What the Works Progress Administration did was it specifically set out to do various public works, like building public buildings or roads or things like that. And it specifically tried to hire people that were out of work to do this as a way to make jobs for them. Now, one of the potential problems, which we will actually see come up later in this chapter with a solution like this, is you have to get the money to pay these people from somewhere. So the government's either going to have to just kind of poof the money into existence by just printing more money, or they're going to have to borrow it from banks. This abundance of money then that they're pumping into the economy, while it can create jobs for people, it's going to have the other effect of raising the price of things, which makes it harder for people to buy stuff with the paychecks they get. So there is no free lunch here. It's not just easy to solve the problem. Nonetheless, Roosevelt wanted to be active. He wanted to be seen as doing something to help people, unlike Herbert Hoover, who was generally of the mind of keeping hands off. Well, Roosevelt had so many programs that he wanted passed that Congress did pass. As I mentioned before, they became known as the alphabet soup programs because each was known by an abbreviation. For example, the Works Progress Administration was the WPA. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was the AAA. Well, there were so many people could hardly keep track of them. But in general, their attitude was they were going to pay people to do stuff. This is because Franklin Roosevelt hated the idea of just giving people welfare, saying, oh, they're poor, we're going to hand them money. Instead, he wanted them to go out and work for that money. That's why most of these programs involve people being given opportunities to work, even if it's for made-up projects that otherwise would not have been done. Such as, well, it might be nice to have a road there, but we don't really need it, but we need to make jobs, so let's go ahead and build the road, which is something the Works Progress Administration might do. A similar sort of program was the Public Works Administration. What it did is it provided grants for local governments, like a city or a county, to build some sort of project. In this photo here, it's a bridge, but it might be a new city hall or a public library. They'd provide the grant to the local government, who would then have to go hire people to build the thing. That provides jobs for those people, and then they take their paychecks and they spend them on other things. And that provides jobs for other people also. So these are all designed to provide a stimulating ripple effect through the economy. But the area in the country that seemed to be lagging behind all others in responding to the New Deal was the South. Now, there were some reasons for this. The South had been devastated by the Civil War and had never quite recovered. Also, the South was still based on an agrarian society. It wasn't a bunch of manufacturers, big factories and things like that. Instead, it was out people working the land. And they weren't exactly set up to receive the benefits of the New Deal either. As I said, there had always been, since the time of the Civil War, a struggle with poverty in the South. This is because during the time of the Civil War, the South had been decimated by Northern armies. Then, even when the South left, when the Northern armies left the South, what they left behind was an economy based on farming and too many workers to work the farms. This was because of the freed slaves and the poor whites. So what happened was the landowners found ways to take advantage of this. They created a system of sharecropping. You've seen this mentioned before in history class, What would happen is both former slaves and white people that were poor would make a deal with landowners that they would work the land in exchange for a portion of the crop that they could take for themselves or sell. Well, this didn't do a lot to make people rich. Matter of fact, across the South during the time of the Great Depression, the average income per person was only $365 a year. If you convert that into our modern money with the rate of inflation, that's still only somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 per year for each person to live on. That's on the edge of poverty. Now, some New Deal programs that were designed to help the country actually arguably made the situation in the South worse. I've already described how many Southerners were landless farmers. They were working as tenants or sharecroppers on land owned by other people and barely scraping by. Then the Agricultural Adjustment Administration comes along, and it tells farmers, we're going to pay you to not raise crops as a way to keep the price of the agricultural products elevated to limit the amount that was being produced. So what happens then if the owner of the land says, fine, I'll take the money and I won't raise crops on my land? What happens to the people who don't own the land but are working it for him for a percentage of the crops? Now they're not allowed to work it. They have nothing. This program, the New Deal, was not designed to help people like the sharecroppers who were all over the South. In this way, the New Deal, in some sense, failed them. But there's at least one program in the South that was a wonderful success that came from the New Deal. That was the Tennessee Valley Authority. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a company owned by the United States government that was set up to build dams and provide electricity for places in the South where electricity had not existed previously. States like Tennessee and Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia benefited from Tennessee Valley Authority projects that created hydroelectric power that then could be distributed to bring electricity to communities where it had not existed before. The idea was that when these communities got electricity, that then they would have more opportunities to engage in business from which they could make profits and get themselves out of the Depression. The reason this hadn't happened before was because power companies had viewed these as risky investments. They didn't know that there'd be enough demand for electricity to warrant the price of building the dams. They also may not have had enough money to engage in giant projects like this. But the United States government could take the risk and did have the money. And in the end, this ended up being a success because the Tennessee Valley Authority turned a profit. They were actually able to sell their electricity for more than they were putting in to create it. This is a wonderful success, but it may be one of the few ones from the Great Depression where the government's attempt to intervene actually had clearly positive results. Well, Roosevelt's concern about how things were going in the South, that it seemed to be lagging behind in recovering from the Great Depression compared to other parts of the country, led to a group called the National Emergency Council going and investigating the South and writing a report. Roosevelt so liked the report that he agreed to write the introduction to it before it was published. So what did this report say? Well, it came to the conclusion that people weren't prospering in the South as much as other places from the New Deal because they had not entirely embraced the New Deal. This exposes part of the problem with Roosevelt's ruling political coalition, which we'll actually talk about later in this chapter. Among those people who supported Roosevelt were Southern Democrats. They were Democrats because there was a tradition in the South of being Democrats all the way back to the Civil War. Because the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, had been seen as the enemy in the Civil War. No self-respecting white Southerner would be seen as a Republican then. So Democrats dominated everything in the South. But those same Democrats were by nature conservative politically. So the idea of these many, many vast government programs just handing out money right and left to people didn't go along with their basic idea of how government should operate. So Southern politicians were not as gung-ho in favor of the New Deal as they were from other places. So the report concluded that that was the problem. Southern politicians had not embraced the ambitions of the New Deal, of using government power to reach down and help the less fortunate. That's why they were lagging behind. And Roosevelt seemed to embrace that excuse for why the South was not progressing as much as other places in the country. The South wasn't the only place of concern. Also was Appalachia. Appalachia is a geographic region in the United States that is not confined to any certain state. Here's a map showing Appalachia. Those counties in the United States government considers to be part of Appalachia. They are called Appalachia because running through them is the Appalachian Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains provide rugged terrain where small communities can rise up fairly well disconnected from other ones. There were a lot of people living out in these regions that, compared to other places in the country, were considered backward in their culture and education and economic power. When the Great Depression came along, it hit them especially hard. Their little communities were not ready to lose what little business they had. People were kind of lost in the countryside, up in the mountains, in the little mountain hollow valleys that they lived in, without adequate education or health care or things like that. It left them in a difficult position to recover from the problems of the Great Depression. So some of the programs focused on helping people in Appalachia. An example of this was the division of subsistence homesteads. This was a program set up to bring people who were unemployed and desperate onto land that they could call their own, that would be big enough that they could raise crops to sustain their own family. Not necessarily enough to sell as farmers, but enough to help their family get by on limited economic opportunities. It was expected that people that received these homestead sites would garden them, farm them in a limited sense to provide for their family, and then get part-time jobs to provide for their other needs. About 30 homestead communities were set up throughout Appalachia to provide seeds for this kind of lifestyle, to make these people more self-sustaining. Another thing that was done for Appalachia was the Rural Electric Administration was founded to string power lines throughout their area so we could get electricity to some of these towns that were considered backward, not up to modern standards. Once they had electricity, then they could bring in electrically operated machinery, home appliances, things like that, to kind of bring them up into the modern world, but also to give them the opportunity to compete and succeed economically. This Rural Electric Administration worked with local communities that created co-ops. The network of wires created by this administration would provide electricity to the community, which then could be sold within it by the co-op that existed there. As a co-op, it wasn't trying to make a profit. It was just trying to bring electricity to people at cost. And this was another relatively successful program. But despite the New Deal being so ambitious, creating so many big programs, and in some cases seeming to be successful, there were those who protested against it. Often their protest was that it had not gone far enough. An example of those who might oppose the New Deal for not going far enough was Senator Huey Long, a United States Senator from Louisiana, with ambitions of becoming President of the United States. He proposed a new way of organizing society economically, which he called Share Our Wealth. And he also, in the same speech, talked about every man being a king. This ended up creating a movement that became known as Share Our Wealth societies, who supported him. The basic idea that he advocated was that people's financial opportunities should be both capped at the top and have a floor at the bottom. The way you would do this was having a government mandate that wouldn't allow anybody to get richer than a certain amount. Anything they produced above that would be confiscated and given to the poor. That way you could provide a basement, a bottom level of how poor a person could be in America. Now, this may sound appealing to people, particularly if they're poor, that you're going to take money from the rich people and give it to them so they can live some sort of at least minimally comfortable lifestyle. But in practice, these things are very difficult. If you put a cap on how much money people can make, they have an incentive to never make any more. So you're not going to have the extra to give to the poor then. Also, if you put a basement on how poor somebody can be, that the government will always give them money to raise them up to that level. If they're comfortable with that level, they have no reason to ever work then. and they just become leeches upon the state. Nonetheless, there were a lot of people that liked this idea, that they would be taken care of by their government by confiscating money from people who had too much. Well, Huey Long never got to see his vision come to life. While he planned to run for president, he was actually assassinated before he could ever become president. Another visionary who thought the New Deal didn't go far enough was a man named Francis Townsend. He was a doctor who had worked with public health care. He saw the horrible effects that poverty could have on elderly people. And so he had this idea that everyone in the country should be guaranteed an old age pension from the government. Once you got beyond a certain age, you could retire and the government would pay for your necessities. Now, while the public and the government wasn't ready to do this kind of thing, this became an idea that eventually led to a very similar government program that we'll talk about in a few moments. Another outsider that complained that the New Deal didn't go far enough was the Reverend Charles Coughlin, oftentimes referred to as just Father Coughlin. He was a Catholic priest who had a radio show. Now, he was a radical, definitely, in his politics. He blamed many of the problems in American society on what he believed was sort of a secret group that controlled the businesses and government for their own benefit. That there was collusion between businesses and government to make the business holders rich while making everybody else impoverished. He even went so far as to claim that it was a Jewish conspiracy. He was viewed by many people as being anti-Jewish. But the most important thing we want to talk about now is his general vision that the strength of society should be used for what he considered to be social justice. That rather than some people getting rich and others suffering, that instead our society should be bent upon bringing the economic means to the lower classes so that they could enjoy the same sort of privileges as other people. He considered this to be justice, moral justice in a social sense for people. That's where our term social justice oftentimes comes from, that is used in America today. It's the same idea that we should use the power of government to redistribute wealth to those who are oppressed because they lack it. Now, to show you just how far his ideas went, let me share a quote from Father Coughlin. He said, "We maintain the principle that there can be no lasting prosperity if free competition exists in industry. Therefore, it is the business of government not only to legislate for a minimum annual wage and maximum working schedule to be observed by industry, but also to curtail individualism. That, if necessary, factories should be licensed and their output shall be limited." So he wanted the government to control what factories could exist, how much stuff they could make, what wages they paid people, how long they could have people work, etc., as a way to control how much people had and try, in his mind, to make society more just. Probably the most significant dissenters, though, from the New Deal, as it would turn out, were the justices of the United States Supreme Court. In 1935, they declared a Central New Deal program, the NRA, to be unconstitutional. This was known as Black Monday among those who believed in the New Deal. And it was a foreshadowing of other programs being declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court too. This was because the people who passed these programs couldn't really point to a specific passage in the Constitution that gave them authority to create these programs. So the Supreme Court struck them down as unconstitutional. This meant that the politicians that supported the New Deal, in a sense, had to go back to the drawing board and figure out some other way to accomplish the things that they were trying to do. This then led to what is known historically as the Second New Deal, another set of programs after the first batch, which was designed in some senses to replace the original batch of things that were being struck down by the New Deal, but also to move into new directions, sometimes very boldly, even beyond what they thought the Supreme Court might say was okay, in a sense to try to force the Supreme Court's hand, because they had a strategy potentially to deal with that too. Among those programs from the Second New Deal was the National Labor Relations Act, commonly known as the Wagner Act. What the National Labor Relations Act did was it supported unionization. It offered legal protection for workers who wanted to form unions. Now, the reason this was important for the New Dealers was they thought a way to help people down at the bottom of the economic ladder make more money was to give them the opportunity to go on strike against their employers and force their employers to pay them more. Well, with the national government now protecting these people from being fired for organizing unions and going on strike, this gave them a powerful tool to use against their employers to get more money. Another law passed during the second phase of the New Deal was the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. It prohibited child labor in businesses. It required businesses to pay a minimum wage to their employees. And it also required them to pay them overtime pay if they worked more than 40 hours a week. Overtime pay was time and a half, as they said. So if you got before you worked overtime, say $10 an hour, then working overtime, you'd have to be paid $15 an hour. These were changes designed to help people in the labor market to make more money. Again, this is an example of the New Deal reaching out and trying to help workers as they challenge the businesses they work for to pay them more. A prominent figure during this second phase of the New Deal was John L. Lewis. He was a union man who helped organize the Congress of Industrial Organizations. This was a national organization that united unions from various cities and various industries to work together. For example, John L. Lewis came from the coal industry and had organized a union there. But his Congress of Industrial Organizations, more commonly known as the CIO, might also have member unions among steelworkers, as in the picture on the right. They tried to get unions organized throughout industries in America and get them to work together. This provides then the workers potentially more leverage as they challenge their employers for better money. They wouldn't just be one small union of a few people, but an entire national organization standing up against the business. An example of a success for the CIO was the United Auto Workers strike at the General Motors plant in 1937. What these workers did was they tried a new strategy, a sit-down strike. They occupied the factory and just stayed there in the way so no business could be done. Here you see them sitting on car seats, putting up their feet, reading the newspaper, just hanging out as they put pressure on General Motors to give in to their demands. And because of the laws that have been passed, General Motors couldn't just come in and fire them all. They had to negotiate with them. And eventually the strikers won the strike, General Motors conceded, gave them higher pay, and they went back to work. This is a big victory for the United Auto Workers and for their affiliated unions in the CIO. Perhaps the biggest victory in the second New Deal was the passage of the Social Security Act. Remember, I told you a few moments ago about the man, Francis, who had advocated for old age pensions. The Social Security Act kind of produced that. The basic idea is when you get old, you get money from the government. But I also told you earlier in this chapter that Franklin Roosevelt was very much opposed to the idea of just handing people charity. So he wanted to set this up as a system where it wouldn't look like welfare. So the way Social Security works is when you are working for an employer, they are required to take money out of your paycheck and send it to the Social Security Administration, where it is held and eventually paid out. Now that sounds like a pension for you, but the reality is the money that you send in is paid out to somebody else right now. You may not be in line to get your money for 40 years, but in the meantime, the money you're putting in is being paid out to other people. And then when you're 65 or older and getting Social Security, then some other young workers will be paying for you. So it's not exactly the kind of thing that Francis imagined, but it's close enough. This is one of those things that the Congress that passed it and the president were very concerned might be declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, as they tried to boldly move into new areas and do additional things that were not authorized by the Constitution. The next section of the chapter deals with equal rights, In other words, how people in other groups, such as racial minorities and women, were treated during the Great Depression and the New Deal. Among the groups that were hardest hit by the Great Depression were blacks. Unfortunately, because of the racism of the day, if a company had to fire workers, it would likely fire its black workers first before the white workers. The same came for hiring workers. They would likely hire white workers first before hiring black workers. This ended up meaning that at the peak of the Great Depression in 1932, while there was a general unemployment rate in the country of 25%, among black workers it was at 50%. It was really hard to find a job during the Great Depression if you were black. The general racism that had existed in the country for decades also was around during this time. Not only did Jim Crow still exist, but there was a great distrust between the races. This is particularly true in the South. In previous chapters, I've talked about how there was a fear among Southern white men of their white women being raped by black men, where merely the accusation of rape against a man could lead to him being killed. Well, this ugly situation ended up destroying the lives of 9 young black men. These 9 young black men that became known as the Scottsboro Boys were riding the rails, as it was said. They were hitching rides on trains without paying tickets. This was a common thing that was done among people during the Great Depression that couldn't afford to ride on trains. They would simply grab onto a train as it passed by, climb in a cargo car, or even sit on the roof as it went from one town to another. Well, these 9 young black men were riding the train, and so was a group of white men. The 2 groups of young men ended up in a conflict, and the 9 young black men threw the white men off the train. Well, the young white men then went to the local sheriff and complained about what happened, and he radioed ahead to the next town where the train would be stopping. Law enforcement there entered the train, and they arrested the 9 young black men. They found there on the train 2 white women too. They asked them what had happened, trying to determine the truth of the conflict that had led to the young white man being thrown off the train by the black men. Well, the 2 young white women, not wanting to get in trouble for being on the train, ended up concocting a story that they had been raped by this group of young men. Now again, because of the racism of the time, they were just believed, even though it was a he said, she said situation, where they claimed rape and the 9 young men claimed it never happened. Well, despite a lack of evidence, they were all convicted of the crime of rape. Some of them were sentenced to death. There was a public outcry from certain segments of society saying that this was a horrible miscarriage of justice. They had no evidence that any crime had been committed, that these men should be let out of prison. The battle went on for decades. Some of them died along the way, never getting out of prison. Eventually, by 45 years later, the last of them was released. This is a well-known story in the history of the United States because it's indicative of the problems that still existed in American society, where racism unfortunately polluted things such as the criminal justice system. The problems of race relations were also a difficulty for Franklin Roosevelt's winning political coalition, known as the New Deal Coalition. Franklin Roosevelt's aggressive government programs had the backing, obviously, of liberal-minded people who always wanted to have an aggressive, active government in people's lives. He also had the support of industrial workers who unionized and farm workers who were receiving the benefits of his government programs. But part of his New Deal coalition that made it possible for him to win were Southern Democrats too, who were much more conservative than what Roosevelt was. But they went along voting for him because of the history of the Democratic Party in the South. Already earlier in this lecture, I talked about this history, that they had this tradition in the South of my father was a Democrat, my grandfather was a Democrat. None of us will ever be a Republican because Republicans, the hated party of the Northerners who came and destroyed the South. So they voted Democratic out of tradition, even though as a matter of policy, they might disagree with Franklin Roosevelt. Well, that's a tenuous relationship. It's fragile. Those people could easily be lost. They could be lost, for example, if the New Deal went too far in violating the traditions of the South. This created a problem for black Southerners. They were intentionally left out of many of the reforms that took place during the time of the New Deal. This was to appease the racism of the white Southerners. So, for example, while Franklin Roosevelt was in office, there was a proposal to end poll taxes. He refused to support that. He didn't want to offend white Southerners. There was a proposal to create a national law to prohibit lynchings. He didn't support that. He didn't want to offend white Southerners who believed in vigilante justice against people who had offended Southern morality. But there were other problems too, even after programs got passed. This can be seen in some of the reforms in New Deal legislation that created various pay scales for different industries, saying that if you do this kind of work, you'll get paid this amount, and Social Security, which provided the retirement benefits for elderly people that we talked about before. There were exceptions built into these programs where you would not be on a pay scale and you would not get Social Security if you were either a farm worker or you were a domestic servant. Well, these were the primary occupations that were worked by blacks. Black men working as farm workers, black women working as domestic laborers. So we took the kind of employment that blacks most often had, and we exempted it from the benefits of the New Deal. This was a way for Roosevelt to essentially wink to the Southern white racists and say, you can go along with the New Deal programs because they're going to help you, but they will not help the blacks that you dislike. A last comment in this section about the diversity of the New Deal and how it helped various groups. Roosevelt tried to do symbolic things for what he considered to be less privileged groups, appointing in some cases black men to various government positions of responsibility. But probably the most obvious of these maneuvers was when he appointed a woman named Frances Perkins to be the first female cabinet secretary in American history. Cabinet secretaries are the leaders of the various departments of government, such as the Department of Defense or the Department of Commerce or the Department of Transportation. And there had never been a woman in charge of any of these until 1933 when Frances Perkins was put in charge. She continued to serve in that position throughout Franklin Roosevelt's presidency until he eventually died in office during his fourth term as the president. Now we move on to the end of the New Deal. The first topic in this section of the chapter I think is a little bit misplaced. It should be back in the part where we talked about New Deal legislation being declared unconstitutional. Because when the Supreme Court started declaring New Deal legislation unconstitutional, this didn't cause Franklin Roosevelt to back off. As we talked about in the second New Deal, he continued to champion and get his Democratic-controlled Congress to pass additional New Deal reforms, in some cases even more aggressive than what they had dared do before, such as Social Security. But he had a plan to get these through the Supreme Court, which many people believed would declare them unconstitutional. His plan became known as a court-packing plan. What he decided to do was get Congress to pass a law that would authorize him as president to appoint a new justice to the Supreme Court for every justice over the age of 70. Well, there were already several members of the Supreme Court who were over the age of 70, which would allow him to appoint new justices. Now, who would he appoint? He would obviously appoint people who would support his New Deal legislation. And in short order, he would have a majority on the court to support his New Deal legislation. Well, many people didn't like this idea. They thought it was too much meddling of him with the other branch of government. And so it never got through Congress, never got passed. But that nonetheless, it had the desired effect. Justices on the Supreme Court were intimidated by Roosevelt's proposal. And one of them, Justice Owen Roberts, switched sides. As New Deal legislation was declared unconstitutional, the votes were oftentimes 5-4. 5 justices saying it was unconstitutional, 4 saying that it was. So when Justice Owen Roberts switched sides, he switched that balance. Now, rather than 5 declaring it unconstitutional, 5 would declare it to be constitutional. Historically, this switch has been nicknamed the switch in time that saved 9. Now, this is a play on an old saying. The old saying was, a stitch in time saves 9. It's the idea if you get a rip in a garment and you apply 1 stitch to it to stop it from spreading, then you won't have to later have the rip get bigger and use 9 stitches to sew it shut. Well, that old saying was switched here to a switch in time that saved 9. It's talking about Justice Roberts switching sides, so that now New Deal legislation made it through the Supreme Court. And the 9 it saved were the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. So Roosevelt didn't have to pack the court to overrule them. Well, what eventually happened was they were old. They retired. Roosevelt was president for a long time. He was eventually able to replace many of them anyway, until there was a solid pro-New Deal majority on the Supreme Court. And none of the rest of his legislation got declared unconstitutional. The New Deal was based on the ideas of an English economist named John Maynard Keynes. Collectively known, this point of view is called Keynesian economics. The basic idea of Keynesian economics is that during a time of economic struggle, what the government should do is it should just spend lots of money. This is a way to stimulate the economy. The hope was that as the government spends money, that will put people to work. They'll then take the money they earned and they will spend it on other things, which will put other people to work, and it will get you out of the recession, whatever it is. Now, economists argue about whether Keynesian economics really makes sense or not, but it was definitely the way that Franklin Roosevelt and the New Dealers were going about fighting the Great Depression. And as they did this, people got used to them fighting that way. People got used to the government programs, the government jobs, etc. And so when they tried to roll them back a little bit, it had a negative effect. That took place in 1937. When Franklin Roosevelt got worried about the level of money that was being spent on the New Deal programs. And they decided that it was time to back off some of them so that the country wouldn't be running such a huge deficit. In other words, spending a lot more money than it actually had. Well, when they did back off and suddenly the economy was not being stimulated the way it was before, a second downturn came. Now we're still in the Depression. So we're talking about a recession within a depression. What had happened is the recession had reached rock bottom in 1932, and the country had been slowly climbing up to a better economic level until 1937, when then they lost ground. And this was blamed on Roosevelt. Well, the loss of support that he got wasn't enough that he ever lost another election and was voted out of office. But he lost enough of support from this that he wasn't able to push through any big programs in the future. He was able to keep the New Deal going as it was, but he couldn't no longer add to it. So what is the legacy of the New Deal? What does it mean for us today as a country? It actually still means a lot. Whether the New Deal actually rescued the country from the Depression is debatable. There are some economists that believe that it actually made things worse and made the Depression last longer. But whether it was good or bad, people at the time believed in Franklin Roosevelt and what he did. And this caused then future presidents to also embrace these same ideals. It also created a whole system of dependency in the country where people came to rely upon government, a system of expectations where, unlike the country before the New Deal, when big economic problems came along, we now expected government to have big economic solutions, to step in and use its power for the good of people. So still to this day, the size and scope of power in the United States of America is a result of the size and scope and power that was introduced during the New Deal. So what's being shown here in these pictures on this slide is a famous photo of Franklin Roosevelt, now with Barack Obama's face imposed on it. It's the idea that you could have future presidents come in with ambitious agendas, and their ideas of how they would use big government to help people were just a new iteration of the New Deal, that they were just simply following Franklin Roosevelt's example. This is the heritage that's been passed down to American politics today from the New Deal. And that ends this lecture for Chapter 23 about the Great Depression.